one and all. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar organized by the Department of English, Royal School of Languages, the Assam Royal Global University. Today's session is on masculinity and imperial performance in George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant. Here I'd like the opportunity to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Abhishek Paroi. Dr. Paroi, who received his PhD from Durham University, UK, is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IIT Madras and an associate fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. Apart from this, he is also a member of International Society for the Study of Narratives, executive member of Modernist Studies in Asia, and member of Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. His research interest primarily centers on modernism, masculinity studies, memory studies, and critical theory. Dr. Paroi is also the author of Postmodern Literatures, which was published by Orwell Blackswan in 2018 and is currently working on his next book, Culture and the Literary Metaphor Memory, which is soon to be published by Roman and Littlefield. Well, a couple of years back, as a PhD scholar myself in the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad, I have been very privileged to be a part of a workshop conducted by Dr. Paroi and on cognitive poetics. So without further delay, let us begin with today's session. Well, dear audience, just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the question answer box in your Zoom panel, and I will bring them up at the end once the presentation is over. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Dr. Paroi to speak on masculinity and imperial performance in Orwell's Shooting an Elephant. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goswami, for the very kind and generous introduction. And I didn't realize we met before in FU Hyderabad. I have very fond memories of that institute, and I do remember that particular workshop on cognitive poetics that was somewhere around 2015, I think. It's always a special pleasure to be back in Guwahati, albeit virtually. I started my career in IIT Guwahati, and I was there for almost 3 years before moving to IIT Madras. So it's always a very special feeling to be associated with Royal University, which is based in Guwahati. So the title of my talk today is based on masculinity and imperial performance. And the case study, if I may use such a term, for that particular theoretical frame is the George Orwell essay, Shooting an Elephant, which I'm hoping will be familiar to most of the attendees. It's a very commonly anthologized and prescribed text for BA and MA courses. Now, before I begin, I'd just like to give a very brief preamble to the idea of imperial masculinity and the way it plays out in Orwell. I mean, Orwell's life, for example, is a very important case study in itself. I mean, it's full of very liminal categories. I mean, he was actually born, I mean, this is pushing it, but it will help us to locate the liminality. He was actually born in the border between Bihar and Nepal, George Orwell, in a village called Motihari. So the very birth of Orwell is a very sort of liminal event, if we could use such a term. So he was born in India. His father was a colonial officer and was born somewhere between Bihar and Nepal. And then obviously he came back to England, did his schooling in England. And I will talk about his schooling a little bit because I think that informs his idea of masculinity. I mean, he went to a public school in England, and public school in England at that time, and even today, it used to be this old boys elite club, right? I mean, that's where the politicians come from. That's where, for example, I mean, Boris Johnson, Cameron, everyone comes from that factory of masculinity. It is what prepares the English males in terms of the ones who would control the kingdom, control the country. So it has this very, very class-conscious, elitist quality about it. And he went to a school called St. Cyprian's. And there's a remarkable essay which I do study. Actually, this particular talk that I'm delivering today is part of a chapter in my new book, which Dr. Goswami mentioned, Culture, Literary, Metaphor, Memory. And the other essay that I think is interesting, and I do recommend it for anyone who's interested in a broader idea of masculinity, is an essay called Such Were the Joys, which is essentially an essay on Orwell's own experiences in a boarding school, in a very elitist institution, where he would be caned for not being manly enough, where it was very class conscious, very elitist, So it was that kind of masculinity which was created and manufactured and then sent off to the empires in order to control the colonies, right? So these were the boys who were supposed to be the cadres of imperialism, people who would be the flag bearers of imperialism. And interestingly, this was also the time where the Boy Scout movement was in its full bloom, right? So we talk about Baden-Powell, for example. Baden-Powell was one of the pioneers for the Boy Scout movement. And interestingly and unsurprisingly, Baden-Powell was a very close friend with Kipling, right? So if you read, for example, Kipling's fictions, if you read Kim, for example, the entire deal in Kim is about creating this boy who would help to map the empire, navigate the empire. The irony, of course, at the end of Kim is it turns out to be an Irish boy, not an English boy, right? So the Irishness of Kim obviously makes it a complex post-colonial text because Ireland was also a colony of England at that time. But the Kipling-esque category of fiction, the Kipling-esque brand of fiction was very much in bed with the Boy Scout brand of masculinity. And interestingly, I would situate Orwell as someone whose fiction deconstructs that masculinity. Because if you take a look at Orwell's Imperial fiction, and the best book for that is a novel called Burmese Days, which is a very cynical, very dark, very unglamorous representation of the empire. And it's exactly this unglamorous quality in which I'm interested in. It doesn't glamorize imperialism at all. So in my book, which Dr. Goswami mentioned, I situate Orwell and Joseph Conrad together, right, as two writers who have a very cynical take of imperialism. And I use the word cynical in a very complex way. They're not really critiquing imperialism entirely. They're not saying empire is bad, it's disgusting. They have this ambivalence about the empire, especially Conrad. I mean, he's not entirely against the empire. He's very much a conservative. Showing us the very dark underbelly of the empire, and he's trying to sort of undercut the Christian missionary principle that Kipling and other people were writing at that time. So even Orwell's writing, I think, needs to be situated in that writerly culture, where he's presenting to us a very unglamorous, cynical, dark, monotonous view of the empire. So if you read Burmese Days, for example, it's full of alcoholic English men who have nothing to do in Burma. They kill themselves, they take prostitutes, they have mistresses, they all hate each other. It's very claustrophobic, it's very neurotic. They either die of malaria or they kill themselves. So it's a very, very dark, cynical, almost like a dystopian tale in some sense. So Orwell's presentation of the empire, I think, is very crucial for our understanding of the masculinity bit that I'm going to talk about. And this essay, of course, is a very short essay, and one can situate this essay, interestingly, as some kind of an appendix to Burmese Days, because this essay too is set in Burma, interestingly, in Lower Burma. And it's the first-hand experience, is autobiographical. It's about what happened to Orwell himself as a writer, as a colonial officer, and he's presenting that to us today for a much later audience. So at the very outset, we need to situate the brand of masculinity that Orwell is representing. So he went to public school. He was this manufactured man who would be created by the public school and then sent off to the colonies to take care of the empire. And what happens in Burmese Days, as well as in Shooting the Elephant, is the cracking down of that construct. That construct cracks down. That construct is deconstructed, not in a theoretical way, but in a very experiential way, in a very biological way. So what we see here is a literal and biological deconstruction of the imperial masculinity. I mean, the imperial man just fails. It comes this close to failing, right? And this particular essay is about, shall we say, the ontology of failure. What is failure? That is the philosophical question that Orwell is asking in that essay. So he fails as a human being, but obviously he succeeds, quote unquote, succeeds as an empire man. So in order to succeed as an empire man, you fail as a human being. So it has this very dark existential take on the entire business of empire masculinity. And for example, Edward Said has written on culture and imperialism, this whole idea of imperial masculinity as this enterprising man, this very resourceful man, etc. So I would situate, this is a bit of a cheeky allusion, but I think it's useful. I would situate Kipling and Orwell as something similar to, let's say, the kind of spy masculinity that we see in James Bond and John Le Carre, right? If you see James Bond, for example, Ian Fleming, when James Bond was written, it's interesting that James Bond, in a way, it is presented to us as this white spy who never runs out of capital, who never runs out of cash, who's always endowed with strength, with capital, with resources. That's actually a fantasy. Because at the time in which James Bond was being written, the British intelligence system was completely decadent. It was absolutely at a ruins. So James Bond is some kind of a nostalgic fantasy of the extension of the empire, the white empire, right? So the English spy who never gets caught, the English spy who never runs out of capital, the English spy who has endless access to money, to women, to all kinds of commodities that are required for the spies, and everything is commodified in James Bond. Now, in direct opposite to that, we have someone like John Le Carre, who's writing a novel called A Spy Who Came In From the Cold, where we see that the condition of the British spy was so miserable at the time that they have to take up librarians' jobs to support themselves economically, right? So that is a very grim, realistic take. So I would situate Kipling and Orwell in a very similar way as I would situate James Bond, Ian Fleming, and John Le Carre. So Kipling gives this very fantastic, fabulous, glamorous, masculinist idea of the empire, whereas Orwell just does the opposite. It gives a very unglamorous, realistic, and very gritty realism of the empire. It really tells you what the empire really is. So in that sense, it's a bit of a heart of darkness kind of narrative, right? It is telling us what really goes on in the empire, right? So before we come to the Orwell essay, Shooting the Elephant, I would recommend for those who are interested in this kind of research, those who are interested in masculinity, imperial masculinity, to read up the Orwell essay, Such Were the Joys, because that talks about the boarding school before he comes to the colonies. So what preparation goes into making those boys as cadres of the empire, right? As the constructed men who go to the empire to control the colonies. And then, of course, it all cracks up. So with that preamble, let us dive into the text, Shooting an Elephant, and see what really takes place. So at the very beginning of the essay, we find that it's an essay about hatred. He hates everything. So he hates the empire ideologically, but at the same time, and this is a funny bit, he hates the Burmese. He hates the Burmese to the guts. And this is exactly the politically incorrect quality in Orwell's essay, which makes it politically important for us today. Right? And I'll say it again. The political incorrectness of Orwell is exactly what makes it politically important for us today. It's a bit like, Joseph Conrad. It's very racist. It's very politically incorrect. But it's exactly why we should read him today. He's not even trying to be politically correct. So he's telling us about the horrors of the empire. But at the same time, in Heart of Darkness, no black man has a voice. No one has a voice. It's all about the white man's panoramic view of Congo. It's all about the white man's existential crisis. The black man never speaks. The subaltern never speaks in Heart of Darkness, right? He's spoken about in some sense. So similar thing happens in Shooting the Elephant. So Orwell is saying, well, ideologically, politically, I'm anti-empire. But at the same time, I hate the Burmese to the guts. I want to kill them all. I want to drive a bayonet into the Burmese people's intestines and kill them because I hate them so much. So this crisscross of hatred is exactly what makes the essay interesting. And in the very beginning of the essay, we find that it's a very claustrophobic, neurotic condition. So he's saying that I was in a police station somewhere in Lower Burma, and I could see the work of the empire from very close quarters. And I can understand there's nothing glamorous about it. There's nothing elevating about it. There's nothing bright about it. It's a very dark, dystopian thing. But at the same time, at a micro level, I hate the Burmese. So you have two different kinds of hatred. The macro hatred, which is ideological against the empire, and the micro hatred, which is against the Burmese people, which works at an individual level. So two different operations of hatred are happening over here. So, and there are some interesting scenes at the beginning of the essay. So he says, the Burmese people hated me, of course, because I was a police officer and I was just a white man. So I was a symbol of hatred, the object of hatred. So hating me would be taking out their the anger against the British Empire. So I'd be this obvious target. But interestingly, how would they retaliate? How would the Burmese retaliate against Orwell? And there's a scene at the beginning of the essay where he is saying that for example, if there would be a football game, the Burmese people would play against me. Suppose a police station is playing against another police station, and all is this white man in that football game. One Burmese man would kick him in a football game, and the referee, who would be another Burmese, would look the other way, would not give a penalty, and the entire crowd would burst in laughter. Now, this is very, very interesting, because a football game, and this is this is a classic masculinist thing, the football game becomes the agony, the public space, right? The safe public space where the white man can be beaten. Because, if the white man gets beaten physically in a football field, well, the worst that can happen is a person beating him would get a red card, right? So the entire sporting politics would protect the non-white man against the white man. So the football field becomes a very political and discursive field in this particular idea. And of course, there are lots of research done on sports and imperialism. And I recommend a book by Nalin Jayasena, which has some very interesting essays on cricket, including an essay on Lagan, in terms of how sports and empire and masculinity, they collude together in very complex combinations. So the football game at the beginning of Shooting the Elephant becomes a very political site, because in it, Orwell, the white man, can be spectacularly beaten. It's a spectacle. There's a crowd coming, and a white man can get beaten up in a football field. But the worst that can happen is you get a penalty. There'd be no jail, because the politics of the game, the grammar of the game would protect you from beating the white man. So that is very described in great details at the beginning of the essay. And then you talked about how whenever you'd walk down a lane, someone would spit beetle juice on him and run away, right? So these are the little microaggressions, these little micro retaliations that he would experience on a daily basis. And that would make him neurotic, because on the one hand, he hates the empire. On the other hand, he, as an agent of the empire, is being hated on a daily level, at a very micro level, at a very micro basis. So this microness of hatred is something which is very, very important for us to locate at the very beginning of the essay. Now, this being the cultural climate in Shooting the Elephant, let's come to the event. So what happens in terms of the event in Shooting the Elephant? So the event, of course, is about the elephant going mad. So Orwell is reported. Some men come to him and say there's a local bazaar, and elephant has become mad. So you need to do something about it, right? So this is the beginning of the point in the essay where being a white man becomes a problem. Why? Because being a white man, you're supposed to be this perfect controller of any confusion, right? So if there's any confusion anywhere, you as a white man, you're supposed to control it. So there's this economy of expectations around the white man that is supposed to fulfill. And the entire essay becomes a project for the white man to satisfy the economy of expectation. And the reason why I am such a fan of the essay is because I think this essay entirely inverts the Homi Bhabha kind of mimicry. Because the Bhabha kind of mimicry is about the non-white man mimicking the white man. Whereas in this particular case, we have the white man mimicking the ideal white man, the ideal white behavior, the ideal white person who can control everything, who should control everything. So the individual white man must always mimic that discursive ideal behavior. So it really complicates the idea of mimicry in the way the Bhabha theorizes it. So Orwell the man must live up to the idea of Orwell the Sahib, the Pakka Sahib, right? The perfect Sahib, the consolidated Sahib. So as a perfect Sahib, he must be the controller of any confusion. He must be, he must tame down everything. He must be able to shoot the elephant. He must be able to hunt down everything. So everything must be controlled by the white man. He must be able to shoot it. He must be able to take care of any potential confusion. Because if he fails in doing it, he entirely jeopardizes the machinery of imperialism. So what happens in the essay as we go on reading it is how the individual will, the individual agency becomes increasingly subjugated compared to the imperial agency. So the imperial agency must be consolidated, must be protected, must be enacted, must be embodied. And therein lies the performative quality of masculinity in this particular essay. So masculinity is a performative category, it's an affective category in this particular essay. The entire embodiment is an affective category. So you must be always performing in front of the natives. So it almost becomes like a customer satisfaction thing, right? I need to satisfy the customer. I need to satisfy the consumer of imperial masculinity. And in this particular case, ironically, it's the Burmese people who become the consumers of white imperial masculinities. And the entire event of shooting the elephant becomes like a tamasha, a spectacular sport. The white man is going to shoot the elephant, the entire village is going behind him. It's like a free sport, right? And the white man must be able to perform the role expected of the white man. So this is the entire theoretical premise of the essay. Now, of course, when the moment he gets to know that there's an elephant gone mad, his initial impulse, his initial response is one of fear. Like any human being, he's afraid. He doesn't want to confront a mad elephant. But he very quickly realizes that a white man mustn't appear afraid in front of the non-white man. And again, this is where the entire idea of compulsory masculinity begins to become important. It is a compulsory performance, right? The white man must appear fearless all the time, because what he's protecting is the commodity of the white man's supremacy, the highest commodity in an imperial space, the white man's supremacy. That is a priceless commodity. It must be maintained at any cost, right? So he, in a way, becomes the commodity. He, in a way, becomes less of an individual and more of a commodity who is obviously protecting the highest community, the highest commodity in the imperial space. And that is the supremacy of the white man. That is a priceless commodity that must be protected at all costs, right? So he as an individual, he as a man, his agency becomes absolutely secondary. And again, this is a very important, interesting take on agency, because normally when we read imperialism, we locate agency with the colonizer and we look at agency-lessness with the colonized. That's the traditional way of locating imperialism. Whereas in this particular essay, the entire politics is reversed. It's the white man who becomes agency-less. He doesn't want to shoot the elephant. He's afraid of shooting the elephant, but he cannot exhibit his fear. He cannot exhibit his ambivalence. And this non-option, he doesn't have the option to exhibit ambivalence. That becomes the classic case of agency-lessness, right? So the agency-lessness is located, ironically, in the white man in this particular essay. And that is the entire deal. That's the entire deconstruction. So as you can see, this essay is a very important post-colonial essay, because it sort of deconstructs a lot of traditional post-colonial scholarship on mimicry, on agency, on embodiment, because we see a white man over here is very anxious to mimic the idea of the perfect white man. And if you read Burmese Days, for example, you find that that is a constant tension. All the white men, they know they have to perform the role of the perfect white man before the Burmese people, before the other people, because they're all the consumers of colonialism, right? So Orwell, the man, becomes less important than Orwell the Sahib. Orwell the Sahib is more important. Orwell the identity, Orwell the ideological identity becomes much more important than Orwell the individual identity. So we have this classic tension between ideology and individuality. Individuality goes completely out of the doors. No one cares about what he wants as a man. He doesn't want to shoot the elephant. He's afraid of shooting the elephant, but he mustn't exhibit any ambivalence or fear. So off he goes to shoot the elephant. And of course, as a classic case, the entire Burmese people, population, they flock behind him. So when I read that particular scene, I'm reminded of the Pied Piper scene. The Pied Piper walking down Hamelin, an entire town walking behind him, the rats walking behind him, as some kind of a spectatorship is about to happen, right? So he goes to the site where the elephant is, and he looks at the elephant and is convinced immediately the elephant must not be shot. The elephant is perfectly harmless. He probably had an attack of some kind of a mood swing. He killed a man in that process, but now she's perfectly fine. So it'll be inhuman, it'll be criminal to shoot the elephant, right? So he doesn't want to shoot the elephant. He's completely decided that if I left to me, I would not shoot the elephant, because it would be a barbaric act to shoot the elephant, because the elephant is absolutely harmless at the moment, right? So he makes up his mind, he stands there. But, and this is the anagnorisis, if you will, in this particular essay, he turns back and he sees about a couple of thousand Burmese people have flocked behind him. They're waiting for him to shoot the elephant. And this is where it really becomes theatrical. And Orwell actually uses theatrical metaphors over here. He says the curtains are going up. I'm an actor, I'm a puppet. I'm about to shoot the elephant. The people are they're heaving a sigh of relief, because they're the spectators who come to see this theater, and they're finally about to watch the theater act. The event is about to happen. So the moment I began to take my aim at shooting the elephant, I could hear 1,000 sighs going up together, right? Finally, the white man is going to shoot the elephant, right? So the whole thing becomes a theatrical sport. And in some sense, again, I mean, look at the various levels of mimicry happening over here. Shooting the elephant in a Burmese town becomes a very crude mimicry of the hunting narrative of imperialism, which is another classic narrative of imperialism. The empire man as a hunter, right? As a tiger hunter, as a wild hunter. So the empire man, the white empire man, must be an able hunter, must be a skillful hunter. And I'm sure that some of you have read or probably doing research on hunting narratives in imperialism. So we can see the tiger was it's like a trophy sport for the empire. Shooting the tiger was a trophy for the white man, because that's like an exertion and an action of the white man's supremacy. It's like I go into the Indian jungle and shoot the most exotic animal. So the hunting narrative, it receives a very crude mimicry in the shooting of a harmless elephant in this particular essay. So instead of a jungle, we have a Burmese town. Instead of a tiger, we have a harmless elephant. So it's a very crude mimicry. It's a very anticlimactic mimicry that takes place. But again, that's another kind of mimicry happening over here. So different levels of mimicry and an operation over here. So we have the man Orwell trying to mimic the white Sahib Orwell that is supposed to, the performance is supposed to do. And we have the shooting of the elephant, the harmless elephant, as a very crude caricature or a mimicry of the grand empire narrative of hunting, right? That is about to happen. And we have a Burmese town who's consuming the narrative. So we have an example of consumption and performance in this particular essay. And this is a point where I use two classic Marxist terms and see how these become complicated in this particular essay. The two classic terms that I'm using in my reading, and of course, this is a summary of what I'm doing in my book. So hopefully when the book comes out, those of you read it would know in details what I'm doing with this. But I'm looking at the two Marxist terms of alienation and commodification or reification. The two classic Marxist terms: reification, a process through which an entity becomes a commodity, and alienation, the process through which the producer becomes distant from the product, right? So, you know, it's a very classic Marxist term. Those of you seen, for example, let's say the Chaplin film, modern times would know what I'm talking about. The producer in the factory is removed from the product outside the factory. Now, in this particular case, let's see how these Marxist terms are being played out. So the man Orwell is being reified into the Sahib Orwell, right? It's being commodified into the Sahib Orwell, the white man Orwell. The whiteness is a commodity over here, the priceless commodity. So the man George Orwell is being constantly reified into becoming the white Sahib George Orwell, and the elephant, the organism, the animal elephant is also becoming a commodity which must be shot, which must be captured, which must be appropriated for the white man's supremacy to be exerted spectacularly. So that's the commodification grammar happening over here. The man becoming a commodity, the creature becoming a commodity in order to satisfy some larger discursive goals. So this is the commodification and reification bit. Now what about the alienation bit? So the producer of that masculinity, George Orwell, is increasingly distant from the product. So the man George Orwell is extremely distant from the white Sahib George Orwell. It's like two different avatars, like a split personality happening over here. So the shooting of the elephant is actually an act of production of a certain kind of commodity. So it's like, and if you read the essay, for example, you'll know that it becomes an automatic process. He shoots the elephant again and again and again. It almost becomes a mechanistic process. It almost becomes an automatic process. And the automatism is important over here, because the automatism is actually taking over the human intervention. It's like a gun shooting a particular creature. And we have something similar, for example, those of you who read How Did Darkness to Know, and as Malo sails down Congo, there's a machine gun which keeps firing over and over again into the jungle. Completely purposelessly. There's no purpose for it. But it's some kind of a machine gun planted over there, and someone forgot to take it off. So the machine gun keeps firing into the jungle over and over again. So this endless, purposeless activity of a machinic production becomes, again, a reflection of commodification, a reflection of reification, and a reflection of alienation. Right? So the man George Orwell is distanced from the white Sahib George Orwell, who is produced in the act of shooting. Right? So the entire shooting of the elephant, it becomes a symbolic act in some sense. And interestingly, we find that when Orwell begins to shoot the elephant, he establishes a sense of empathy with the elephant. Right? And if you look at the language carefully, and Orwell obviously is a very fine writer, is a very fine literary writer, and this is why we need to take literature seriously. Because literature as a coded language, it gives away a lot of psychological locations. If you see the descriptions of that Orwell is using at that time, he's essentially humanizing the elephant. He's calling the act a murder, for example. He's using human pronouns for the elephant. She is dying, or he is dying. And he's he's using a technique of deceleration. He's slowing down the whole process. So you can see the elephant dying in a very slow motion, cinematic kind of a way. So the trigger is shot, the bullets are fired. You can see the bullet going, hitting the elephant in the head, and the elephant is tremoring, is shivering, is coming down gradually. And the next bullet goes, and the next one. So the whole thing is decelerated, right? The whole thing is defamiliarized in some sense. And again, it's something which Conrad does a lot, defamiliarization, right? So Orwell is defamiliarizing the entire episode. He's slowing down the entire episode, and he's establishing in some sense a sense of empathy with the elephant, because the death of the elephant is symbolically also the death of his agency. So the dying elephant becomes like an architecture of the death of its agency. So the elephant dying is a spectacular example of its own agency dying, because he doesn't want to shoot the elephant, but he sees the elephant dying in front of him. So essentially it means whether he wants to shoot the elephant or not, it doesn't matter. Because he is the white man, must perform the role of the white man which is ascribed to him. It's like a pre-ascribed script, and he must live up to the script entirely. So the entire performative quality of Orwell in this particular essay is a mimicry of the ideal white masculinity. And those of you interested, for example, in torture studies, you know that in case of torture, when a torture goes on, interrogation, torture goes on, empathy becomes a very important category. And the two kinds of empathy, shallow empathy and deep empathy. A shallow empathy would actually help the torture process, because if you want to torture someone, and if you want to sort of understand how the torture would happen to the other person, how the pain would happen to the other person, if you have a shallow empathy, you as a torturer will be more efficient, because you'll be able to torture the person better, because you'll be able to imagine yourself as being affected by the torture. However, if the empathy becomes too deep, then you'd actually begin to suffer the pain. Then you can't carry out the torture. So torturers are trained to exercise shallow empathy instead of deep empathy. Whereas in this particular case, in shooting the elephant, what we have is an establishment of a deep empathy, right? So he's shooting the elephant against his will, but each shot is actually a shot against his own agency. So he's dying. He, the person, is dying. So elephant crumbling to death. And that's the reason why he's using the word murder. The human metaphors are very, very important. So interestingly, the animal is being humanized and a human is being mechanized in Orwell. So a complete inversion. So he becomes a machine gun in some sense, who's firing at an organism because he must fire all the time. And while he's doing that, there's a lot of epiphanic statements that he's making. And he's saying, for example, there's a lovely paragraph where he's saying, a white man mustn't appear afraid before the non-white man. He wears a mask and his face grows to fit it, right? So mask and face. So the face as an organic entity and mask as an artificial entity, they begin to blend together. It's an entanglement of the artificial and the biological, till the point that you can't differentiate between the two. So the face becomes the mask in some sense, and the mask becomes more precious than the face, right? So the face becomes completely secondary. The mask becomes more important, and you must maintain the mask all the time, right? And of course, the other fear is, when he looks at the elephant and he's trying to shoot the elephant, he's thinking that, I mustn't miss my shot, because if I miss my shot and the elephant charges at me and I get killed, it's not so important that I die. I mean, that's obviously there. The fear of death is always there. But the more important concern is that the non-white people would laugh at me. And there's a lovely line where it says, the life of every white man in the East is one long struggle not to be laughed at. And you almost begin to feel sorry for the white man in some sense, right? So it's a very neurotic condition where he has to perform some kind of a role that is assigned to do. He has to be this brave man, he has to be this perfect man, he has to be this flawless controller of confusion, etc. And if he fails in his duty, if he fails in his project, he'll be laughed at. And if he's laughed at, he would be compromising the entire machinery of imperialism. That must be protected. So Orwell, as an agent of the empire, must protect the empire at all costs, right? So it's a very racist essay. He talks about the Burmese. He describes them as yellow faces. He hates them. The descriptions of Burmese are very, very offensive. But at the same time, we have this deep, dark epiphany coming out of the white man. And this is exactly why I want to leave it. I don't want to whitewash Orwell at all, just like I don't want to whitewash Conrad. I don't want to make them politically correct. I think we should leave the political incorrectness as it is, because that political incorrectness is exactly what we need to understand in terms of the historical location of that particular essay. I mean, they're not even trying to be politically correct in some sense. So the political incorrectness becomes the political significant thing in this particular essay. So the entire episode of shooting the elephant is described in a very decelerated way, and the bullets go out to shoot the elephant, and the elephant dies, and it doesn't really die. Orwell just shoots it again and again and again, and this constant, endless shooting of the elephant, in a way, after one, it becomes a Sisyphean exercise, because the elephant is not dying, and it's shooting it all the time. He wants to kill it, because he wants to liberate it in some sense. The elephant is dying a very slow, gradual death. It's like a torture scene. It's very graphic, it's very disturbing and unsettling in some sense. So he gets a smaller rifle and starts shooting it into the mouth of the elephant, just to help the dying process, just to liberate it. But it still doesn't die. and then it goes away. It's like a classic Sisyphean thing. He can't do anything about it. So the purposelessness of the entire activity is spectacularly presented. And then he goes back, and then he finds out later that the elephant was skinned and was taken away by the Burmese people who essentially devoured it. And again, that becomes a very crude example of consumption in some sense, because we have, on the one hand, again, we're looking at biological consumption and ideological consumption almost blending together, because what was being consumed was the activity of the white man's supremacy, right? Him shooting the elephant, that was spectacularly consumed. And at the end of it all, the flesh gets consumed. The biological organism gets consumed. So it almost becomes, it's like a cannibalistic mode of consumption, right? So the ideological consumption and the cannibalistic consumption almost blend together in some sense. And again, look at the way in which the Burmese talked about. I mean, the white man seems to know exactly what all the Burmese people did. The white man seems to know exactly that every Burmese people must be a cannibal. So that offensive racist thing is always there, right? In Orwell's writing. It doesn't come out of that at all. He's very offensive, very racist. His depiction of the Burmese is extremely offensive in several senses. And of course, there's no woman at all. And the entire political agony. It's all men. It's the Burmese men, the white man, superintendent, everyone is a man. This complete and conspicuous absence of a female becomes very, very important. It's almost a very visible absence. There's no female at all, except perhaps the elephant who gets killed at the end. He comes back to his police station, and he gets to know later that the elephant was killed and the flesh was eaten. So this cannibalistic consumption and ideological consumption blended together. And then the final bit becomes interesting. So when he comes back, when he goes to the Colonial Club later, and again, the Colonial Club is a very important symbolic site in Orwell's writing. If you read Burmese Days, for example, the club becomes a very important space. It's like a liminal space in some sense, because it's not entirely public. It's not entirely private, right? It's an exclusive space where the men come and get drunk and open up and they misbehave. They do things which they're not supposed to do, etc., etc. It's a space where they're supposed to let the guards down a little bit. And if I may digress a little bit, there's a very funny scene in Burmese Days where there's a very offensive, racist man. I don't remember the name of the person. He's not Flory, not protagonist. Some other man comes in the Colonial Club in Burma and orders whiskey and ice. So he calls the waiter and tells him, hey, get me a whiskey and some ice. And the waiter comes back a few minutes later and tells him, well, I'm sorry, sir, we have run out of ice. Can I give you whiskey and soda instead? And then this guy gets very threatened. He says, and how come you're speaking so good English? I mean, you should be saying, no ice, master, no cool. We should be firing you if you speak so well. I mean, I can't even relax in a Colonial Club. I mean, how does people learn so good English? And that is obviously a very important take on an entire Macaulay project, right? So what happens if the Indian servant speaks too good in English? That becomes a threat for the white man in the Colonial Club, because the Colonial Club becomes like it's like a proxy Britain, right? It's where the people will come in and there's white people all around. They can let the guards down, do sexist jokes, make racist jokes, and just be buddies with each other. And Indians obviously there as invisible presence, servants who are just supplying kebabs and whiskey. So if an Indian makes his presence felt with a very impeccable English, then that becomes a problem in some sense. So the end of Shooting the Elephant, it ends at the Colonial Club, interestingly. And there's a very interesting essay by Mrinalini Sinha called Masculinity and Clubbability in the Empire. Mrinalini Sinha is a fantastic writer if you want to know more about English imperialism, especially she's got a brilliant book called The Bengali Babu, The Effeminate Bengali Babu, and The Manly Englishman. And as Bengali myself, I find it very amusing. It's like a total deconstruction of the entire construct of the effeminate Bengali man, which we see in Kipling, for example. There's a very fat Bengali man in Kipling who was very incompetent. Kipling's Skin, for example, was very incompetent, who is like a Macaulay mimic man who wants to speak perfect English, but he's failing. He's very fat. He wants to dress up as an Englishman, but he's a caricature, etc. So I do recommend Mrinalini Sinha's book and essay. So anyway, just to conclude, Shooting the Elephant, Orwell comes back to the Colonial Club, and there's a very heated debate going on between the young white men and the older white men, right? And the younger white men are saying, oh, it's a damn shame that he shot the elephant. Why would he shoot the elephant? I mean, it cost more than a coolie. I mean, it just killed one Indian coolie. I mean, you should be protecting the elephant. I mean, elephant costs more than a coolie. So you actually wasted a bigger commodity, right? You should have just let it go. It's a damn shame that he shot the elephant. So older white men, they actually say you do the right thing by shooting the elephant. And this is actually very, very interesting, because the older men, they seem to know that the most priceless commodity in the empire is the white man's supremacy, which costs more than anything else. So by shooting the elephant, Orwell actually consolidated the pricelessness of that commodity. So they're agreeing with Orwell. They say, you do the right thing. Whereas the young, inexperienced men, they're taking the commodity value thing at a literal face, right? So they're saying the elephant costs more than a coolie, so the elephant should have been saved, and the coolie should have been let go. The dead coolie is not a big deal, right? So why did they shoot the elephant? Because the elephant costs more than a coolie. So they're talking about cost at a literal level. Whereas the older white men, who know better, who are wiser, who spend more time in the colonies, they know that elephant must be shot, because the shooting of the elephant is an action of the white man's supremacy, which is the most priceless commodity in the colonial setting, right? So that is the end of the essay. And and of course, the final sentence is a brilliant sentence, and Orwell is saying, I hope no one found out that I only shot the elephant in order to avoid looking like a fool. Right? So the entire compulsion to hide, to conceal the anxiety, the threat, the neurotic self, and by performing all these grand narratives of masculinity is actually a defense mechanism of saving yourself from being found out, right? And that becomes the really interesting point in which the essay ends. So just to conclude, I think this is a very fine case study of imperial masculinity, especially because it gives a very dark, cynical picture of what imperial masculinity was. I mean, it's not a Kipling-esque picture of grandiose Christian missionary narrative. It's not that at all. It's about it's a bit like Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe is saying, well, once you go to the empire, you find out there's nothing grand about it. It's just an exploitative mission, it's a looting mechanism. Of course, you have to come back home and lie about it, right? Whereas in this particular case, Orwell knows that what goes on in the colonies, there's nothing glamorous about it. It's very nakedly profit-making enterprise, and you're just performing a particular role. So masculinity becomes a performative category, masculinity becomes an affective category, and lastly, masculinity becomes an anxious category. So the anxiety becomes very, very important. It's like a biological, medical anxiety of constantly consolidating the construct of the Pakka Sahib. And the word Pakka keeps coming in Burmese days in shooting elephant. Pakka, of course, is a Hindi word, which means cemented, which means strong. So you have to be the Pakka Sahib all the time. So you must be constantly projecting that whiteness, which will be consumed by the colonies, by the colonial people, and that active production consumption. So in a way, I'm just ending by saying how this essay and Burmese days, it reverses the consumption production mechanism. So there is a white man producing an ideological construct which is being consumed by the non-white man. So at an abstract level, the consumption production mechanism is deconstructed. So as you can see, hopefully my little lecture here will have shown that this entire essay can be seen as a deconstruction of some of the very stereotypical ideas of colonialism and masculinity that we commonly read. So it's a deconstruction of mimicry, for example. It's a deconstruction of the entire production consumption mechanism, and also the deconstruction of the alienation and commodification that we see coming in through Marx. So I ended this point, and I'm happy to take a few questions if there are any. Thank you.
Well, that was quite an interesting and insightful take on Orwell. Thank you so much, Dr. Parroy. So with that, we will go ahead and take a few questions. We already have a lot of questions pouring in. So this first question is by Akshat Shukla, and his question is, do you think that the writer serving as an officer is just a disgruntled personality at that time, stuck between two extremes of thoughts? On the one hand, he is an officer employed by the empire, which is indifferent towards him. And on the other hand, he is serving in a nation where he is looked down upon. And his Shakespearean dilemma of to shoot or not to shoot stems from his very position as an official from the empire serving in the hostile country.
That's a very elegant question. Thank you. The Shakespearean metaphor obviously is very progressive, and the last word, fool, is very Shakespearean, I think, where he's saying, I just did the act because I wanted to avoid looking like a fool. I mean, the classic Shakespearean fool is someone who knows everything, but he cannot act because he doesn't have the agency. So if you take a look at all the fools in Shakespeare, Feste in Twelfth Night, the fool in King Lear, they seem to be the people who can see through the entire disguises, entire deceptions. But because of their political, cultural, and social locations, they don't have the agency to play it. Because whatever they say will not be taken seriously. And that's the compulsory condition of the fool. So I think the Shakespearean analogy can definitely be pushed. In terms of the first half of the question, I think it's a very valid question, because on the one hand, he he realizes he's a nobody in the empire. The empire is just a very disposable commodity in the entire empire. If he goes away tomorrow, if he gets sacked tomorrow, there'll be another white man who would come and do something which is equally replaceable, right? So he's equally replaceable. It's collateral damage. So that indifference is very much there as an experiential category, right? So he's indifferent to the empire because the empire is indifferent to him. But I think what complicates this even further is always biological location, historical location. Someone who was actually born in India, right? So he's very much an empire child. He was very much someone who was born in Bihar. I mean, if you go to Bihar, for example, there's a village called Motihari where he was actually born. I mean, there's probably the house if you investigate deep enough. So he was actually born in India. So in some sense, he has a rootedness in India, which then goes back to Britain, and then it goes back to India again. So it becomes a very complicated movement, I think. And the indifference becomes interesting because he wants to be not indifferent. He wants to intervene. There's a desire for intervention which is always there, an almost romantic desire for intervention. But he realizes at every point that intervention is an impossibility. And the knowledge of the impossibility of intervention, I think, is exactly what informs the agency-lessness in this particular essay. That no matter what I do, I cannot intervene. And that is depicted in a very crude level when at the end he's trying to shoot, he's trying to kill the elephant. He's trying to intervene in the painful process. He shoots the elephant in the mouth. He brings a smaller rifle. He keeps shooting again and again and again. It's a very graphic, gruesome scene, really. It's very unsettling. It's, it's blood-curdling in some sense. The elephant doesn't die. It'll only die when it's supposed to die, right? So even at a killer level, he cannot intervene. So his absence of intervention, I think, is what makes his position so precarious in some sense. And of course, I'd agree with the person who asked the question that his knowledge that he's completely replaceable, that he's just collateral commodity. Anyone can come in tomorrow and do the job that he's doing. That knowledge obviously it informs the cynicism as well. So it becomes very cynical, indifferent take. But there is that residual desire to intervene, which fails. So the entire essay is about a failure. And ironically, it becomes a failure because it succeeds in being the white man. So the entire ontology of success and failure, they get reversed, they get deconstructed in this particular essay. But thank you for that full bit, because that's something that I've always believed in, because the Shakespearean thing is very much there, the Hamletian dilemma, to shoot and not to shoot, to kill and not to kill. But also the last bit, the fool thing, I always think it has a very Shakespearean ring to it. That, I only did it because I wanted to avoid looking like a fool, right? Because the fool in Shakespeare, I think, is a very, very complex character. He's someone who knows everything but cannot intervene. So that almost connects that particular character to Orwell's persona in this essay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the next question is from Professor Krishna Barra ma'am. So ma'am's question is, how do you equate Orwell's reproductions of power with Foucault's power, knowledge, intentions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But thank you, Krishna Barra, for that. And thank you for attending this. It's a pleasure to interact with you. I've actually got, I'm just reading out this bit from my book draft where I mentioned Foucault, and I'm very glad that you brought it out, because what Foucault says about the left intellectual is something which Orwell mentions. Yes. So I'm reading, this is Foucault 1972, and the reference is from Power Knowledge. Well, what a coincidence. Anyway, so this is where Foucault is saying that shooting the elephant, I mean, he's not mentioned shooting the elephant. I'm using Foucault to map shooting the elephant. And I'm saying this particular essay, it dramatizes the distinction that Foucault makes between the left intellectual who acknowledges the question of justice and a specific intellectual who is embedded in a real material struggle. So at an intellectual level, he is obviously very left-wing, in terms of the knowledge, he's very left-wing. He realizes what he's doing is wrong, what he's doing is unfair, etc. But at an immediate personal level, he realizes he's embedded in the system. So, he's very much a part of it. So there's almost like a bipolar generation of a bipolar self, really. So as a left intellectual, he wants to locate himself as a left intellectual on the left. Obviously, Orwell was a communist, and he wrote lots of communist tracts later. So he's a critique of the empire. He is someone who disregards the empire. But as someone who is experiencing it at a real material everyday struggle level, and this is on page 126 from Foucault's Power Knowledge, Orwell is very much embedded in it. So on the one hand, There is a desire to come out of the matrix and critique it. But on the other hand, there's an admission that he's part of the matrix, right? So he's critiquing something that he's a part of, right? And that becomes a very cynical for him. That almost makes it melancholic. And I use the word melancholia in a very Freudian sense. Melancholia as a self-hatred, as self-loathing. He loathes himself. You know, the self actually, the ego of the self is deflated. It's a classic Freudian melancholia. The ego of the self is deflated. Self-loathing happens because you realize what you hate is exactly what you are. That's the classic Freudian melancholia. And it's exactly what happens over here. What he hates as an intellectual, from the position of knowledge, from the position of the epistemic position, that is exactly what he is in terms of material everydayness, right? So the Foucault-Freud thing really works well, I think, in this particular way, because his object of hatred becomes himself in some sense. And that hatred makes it melancholy. And if you push it further, I think, and I'm glad this question came up, this is so typically brilliant of Krishna Bhairava. If you push it further, you find that there's a degree of emptying out of the ego. The ego gets emptied out in the end. So he becomes like a hollow man in the end. So the hollowness is what happens in the end. So he's just a fool. He doesn't know what to do. Because the ego, with its agency, with its ability to intervene, that gets completely poured out. That gets completely emptied out. Because he, as an intellectual, is exactly what he is as a human subject. So the entire hatred comes back to him. So he becomes a subject as well as the object of hatred. So that is a classic Foucauldian position, right? So the object becomes a subject. And in the process, what is produced is a very Freudian melancholia, where you're so melancholy that your ego gets deflated out. So he becomes, in the end, the hollow man. It's like a zombie who's just carrying out what he's supposed to carry out. It's like a hollow man who doesn't have any intervention, doesn't have any agency whatsoever. So I think the Foucault power knowledge paradigm really works well in this particular essay.
So we have another interesting question by Indrakshi B. Dr. Robin Banerjee, environmentalist, who put Kaziranga National Park, Assam, on the world tourism map, had said, and I'm quoting, "It is the Britishers who started the trail of destruction of wildlife worldwide." So the pregnant elephant who died yesterday in Kerala, stuffed with a pineapple riddled with crackers inside it, stands a testimony to it. So Indrakshi B's question is, how does masculinity as portrayed by the character in Shooting an Elephant bear resemblance 84 years later on today?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, the whole idea of the empire masculinity was a project of mapping. So you map the forest. So hunting becomes a mapping activity. So the exotic forest must be mappable. So the tiger which gets hunted as a trophy animal in the classic hunting narrative is a testimony of the British white man's mapping of the exotic forest. So the forest can get mapped, right? So the mappability quotient is exactly what works for the empire narrative, right? So the whole hunting narrative is a project of mapping the empire, the exotic spaces of the empire must be mapped, must be mappable. So in that sense, the mappability thing was a very crucial component of imperialism from the very word go. And mappability and masculinity are very comparable categories because both work with empirical knowledge, both work on instrumental knowledge. Knowledge must be instrumental, must be quantifiable, must be empirical. And the empirical quality, the quantifiable quality, the mappable quality of the entire process of imperialism is exactly what makes it masculinist in quality. Because then you can draw that from the Enlightenment logic entirely, where rationality is male, logic is male, quantifiability is male, and the reverse is female. So obviously the forest becomes an exotic female space, which can be mapped by the white man with his compass and his gun and his map and his atlas. So the gun, the compass, all these become instruments to which the female anarchic forest can be mapped. And of course, the mappability or the process of mapping is also a process of destruction, because what you're destroying in the process is the naturalness of the entire process, because you are essentially, you're manicuring it in some sense, because you're mapping it. You know exactly what the tiger is. You know exactly what the, if you make a wildlife reserve, for example, right, what you're doing is you're making that, it's like a Kubla Khan thing, twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled around. So the wildness of the space must be girdled with twice 5 miles. right? So it must be quantified in some kind of a precision politics thing. So that obviously it's a very valid question, and it's something which can be traced back to the entire imperial machinery thing, where the masculinist machinery, with its instrumentality, with its logic, with its empiricism, that was used, that was directed towards controlling the potentially anarchic, the potentially female space of the forest. And of course, as we see in Orwell, the hunting, the shooting of the elephant becomes a very crude caricature of the grand hunting narrative. Right, but the problem here in Orwell's essay is he's a very unwilling hunter. He's a reluctant hunter, and the reluctance of Orwell is exactly what makes it so political. He's not someone who's willing to play with the flow of imperial politics. He doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to shoot the elephant. He thinks it's inhuman. He thinks it's barbaric. He thinks it's cruel to shoot the elephant. It's an act of human cruelty. But he realizes very soon it's compulsory cruelty. It's cruelty which must be performed in order for the entire imperial machinery to spectacularly manifest itself. So in a way, it becomes a very spectacular reflection of the cruelty of imperial masculinity, which relied on destruction, violence on the body, on the nature, on topography, on the entire space of the colony, in order to control and consolidate this project, this masculinist project of the empire. So I think it's a very, very valid question. And I think what happened in Kerala yesterday, where this anarchy of putting firecrackers inside the elephant, is a very grotesque act of violence, very, very grotesque. And the grotesqueness is what is disturbing. It's not like a normal killing thing. It's not like an elephant was killed in a way that we normally associate. Of course, any act of killing an animal is brutal, is barbaric, is tragic. But the almost orchestrated way in which this was done, it's almost like an artful way of killing a particular animal, right? And that almost becomes a very masculinist thing. It's like, let's experiment a little bit and see how long it takes for an animal to die. They put crackers inside it. And of course, the femaleness of the animal becomes very, very political. It's a pregnant elephant, right? So the violence becomes very direct. The violence becomes very, very masculinist in that particular sense. So I really think it's a very, very interesting connection that the person is making. So thank you for that as well.
So I'm going to combine two questions. One is more of an observation. Diptangshu Das says that, how this talk actually kind of reminded of J.M. Coetzee's novel, Waiting for the Barbarians. The rebellious magistrate in the novel experiences a similar kind of crisis of masculinity. And secondly, the act of hunting is juxtaposed with imperial violence. So along with that, I would also like to pose a question given by Bhatima Burman, who says that, can we say that there's a similar strain of masculinity in Golding's Lord of Flies as well?
Yeah. It's
Coetzee and Golding.
Yeah, I mean, the Coetzee thing is very direct, it's very organic. I mean, the Waiting for the Barbarians thing. And I sort of place Coetzee, Orwell, and Conrad together, some kind of a linear take on empire. Because with Coetzee, it becomes the other way around in some sense. If you come to disgrace, for example, it's violence from the other end coming in. And the white man becomes a passive receiver of that violence in some sense. And Waiting for Barbarians too, it has this passive wait for violence to happen. Is something which I think can be directly connected to Orwell's essay. He becomes a perpetrator as well as a sufferer of violence in some sense. Because at a very epistemic way, and this connects back to Krishna Badu's question, at an epistemic level, the violence happens to himself, right? At an epistemic level, if you look at power knowledge of Foucault, I mean, use knowledge as an epistemic category. At an epistemic level, the violence is directed towards himself, right? So he as a human being suffers the violence because he realizes with a knowledge that doesn't have any agency at all. And that knowledge essentially is a violence against him, right? So we have that physical violence, which is centrifugal from him to the outside. And we have this existential epistemic violence with a centripetal from the outside to the inside. So we have this loop of violence going in. And this is exactly, I think, what Krishna Badu meant with this Foucault position of power and violence. And of course, that's something which you see in Coetzee as well. In terms of the Lord of the Flies, I haven't thought of it, but I think it's a connection that one can make. But I need to go back and reread the novel, and in terms of having a more satisfying response to that question. But it's definitely a connection one can explore. Yeah, thank you.
So Uttam Barua has this question. Is this the idealization of the Britishers by the natives that helped the British in setting up and expanding their empire?
That's a very good question, and I use Gramsci in my book in terms of looking at this whole idea of consent, right? So there are two ways, of course, the two classic ways in which you can control the empire. One is coercion, which is a brutal way of beating up people, putting people in prison, etc. But the most sophisticated way is consent. If you can make them willing subjects of domination, if you can make them willing consumers of domination, then that becomes the more sophisticated way to exert your violence, because that also takes away any potential for rebellion. Because the people are willing subjects, if they are indoctrinated in terms of consuming the supremacy of the racial master, then obviously any potential for rebellion is quenched right there. Right? So the whole idea of Gramsci's consent, I think, becomes very important in this particular essay, because in a way, one can read this essay in terms of saying how the Burmese people push the white man into becoming the ideal white man in some sense. Because the white man, the individual, the biological white man, is reluctant to be the discursive white man, right? But he's pushed to becoming the discursive white man by the Burmese people, because they all expect him, because they are such consumers of the supremacy of the white man. And that supremacy has been consumed through generations, through force, through consent, through brutality, through imprisonment, through language, through epistemic instruments, all kinds of things. So till the point comes where the white man's supremacy is unquestionable in some sense. So that economy of expectation is already set, right? And Orwell must play a part. And there are lots of theatrical metaphors in this particular essay. Those of you who read it would know he used the puppet metaphor, for example, over and over again. He's saying, I'm just a man with a gun. I'm a hollow dummy. And the word dummy also comes in. I'm a hollow dummy who's just supposed to carry out the role he's supposed to perform. I mean, the script is already written, right? The activity is already set for me. And all I have to do is just perform it, right? And all these people behind me have come to consume the act. So I must perform it. So I think one can definitely use Gramsci. One should definitely use Gramsci in terms of looking at how coercion and consent work as an entanglement in this particular essay to push the white man. Ironically, this is the irony of the essay, right? The white man is forced to be the white man by the non-white in some sense, because such is the degree of indoctrination. And if we use Althusser, for example, if you use a term such as interpellation, right, which is I find it's a very complex term, interpellation. Interpellation is a process through which an ideological observation, an ideological instrument is being endlessly reproduced and internalized in a way till the point where it doesn't remain a construct. It becomes a given. It almost becomes a metaphysical given, right? It becomes a grand narrative, which is metaphysical in quality. And the whole point of interpellation is to conceal the constructedness of that particular category, that a white man's supremacy is a construct. It's a political construct. It's a racial construct. But in order to become a grand narrative, it must be concealed. No one must find out that it's a construct, right? So the concealment of the constructed quality is exactly what interpellation does. So I think I agree with the person asking the question entirely. And I think one should use Gramsci and Althusser to explore this essay further. Yes, thank you.
It's already 4, but if you're fine with that, fine with it, could we go ahead and take 2 more questions?
Yes, why not?
All right. So this is by Stuti Goswami. The liminality of the imperial agent questions compulsive masculinity that is attached to the imperial as well as colonial project is undermined and, as you say, deconstructed. Now, could we also see this as indicating towards a dialectic between the essentialism and social constructionism of the imperial subject?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, the whole idea of the this essential thing, obviously, the essentialized thing is obviously the white man's supremacy. That is not essentialized entirely in this essay. But what happens in the essay is, and I think I use the term interruption in my book. What gets interrupted is the essentialized construct, the essentialized consumption, and essentialized performance of the white man's supremacy. And the little moment we're always thinking, should I shoot the elephant or should I not shoot the elephant, can be seen as an active interruption. So the entire essentialist frame that the essay particular has, this essay particularly has, I think can be seen as an interruption of the pre-given supremacy of the white man. So I think that's a very valid question. I would agree entirely. Yes.
So we have this another question by Dhiraj Barkutoki. How far was George Orwell was under the false ego and arrogance of the British Empire?
Well, he was definitely, this is a complex question because there is an ambivalence about him because he hates the British. And his hatred of the British in a way, and this is exactly why I mentioned the boarding school essay. If you read that particular essay, well, Orwell describes his own boarding school experience. He's saying, I mean, these British men around me, these British boys and girls around me, I mean, they are such egoistic people. And his location as someone born in India and who's come back to Britain, not to wealthy parents, but he won a scholarship to go to the school. But he's surrounded by people who are just toffee-nosed aristocrats and essentially brats, who play cricket, get drunk, have very rich fathers, etc. So he's very much an outsider even in that setting. So what I find is, and this I think connects to the earlier question as well, there's a quality of permanent outsiderness in Orwell. I mean, he's an outsider everywhere. I mean, he's an outsider in Britain because of someone who's born in India and has come back in Britain. He's an outsider in India because of his racial location as a British. He's an outsider in Burma as a police officer. And lastly, he's an outsider to himself because he is someone who he hates ideologically. Right? So this permanent outsiderness is something which really complicates Orwell's personality. He's an outsider. It's like a Camus thing about him. He's always an outsider. He's always a stranger. And this constant production of estrangement is something I think was what makes Orwell very, very political in quality. I mean, do read the essay, Such Were the Joys, because it's a very disturbing essay actually, because it talks about how there'll be a matron every day who'd come to his bed, and this is it's almost sexual. The matron would come to his bed and check his bed sheet and find out if he had wet his bed or not. Because a bedwetting boy would be seen as an insufficiently male boy who would be caned in front of the whole school, right? He'd be dragged in front of the whole school and be caned in front of the whole school. And there'll be lots of medical writings on euneresis. Euneresis was bedwetting. So bedwetting boys were seen as either, sexually insufficient, physically insufficient, would be subject to shame, brutality, discrimination, and all of that is there in that particular essay. So he said the first impulse that I had when I woke up every morning was to check my own sheet and realize if I wet my bed or not. Because if the matron found out if I wet my bed, I'd be caned by the principal in front of the whole school. So this whole idea of being an outsider everywhere, biologically, politically, existentially, that I think really complicates Orwell's position as a critique, as an intellectual. And also, I mean, see, at the end of the day, we might say lovely things about Orwell, but at the end of the day, he's an agent of the empire. He's very much in the payroll of the empire. He's working as a police officer in Burma, right? So he's very much identified as an empire agent. So there is a double critique thing. So this is exactly, I think, what Krishna Bharata meant. I mean, he is the subject as well as the object of his own critique. Right, so he's the subject of criticism is himself, intellectually and ideologically, he's hating the empire thing. But at the same time, as someone who's embedded in the material practices of the empire, he becomes the whole object of his own criticism. Right, so that idea of a double personality and the situation of being a permanent outsider is, I think, what really complicates Orwell's position existentially as well as politically. And this is where the liminality bit comes in. He's always in between two positions, politically as well as existentially. And that's what I mentioned when I said, if you push it further, he was actually, the liminality is just, he's like cursed to be liminal. He was actually born in the borders between Nepal and Bihar. So even his birth is a liminal location, geographically speaking, right?
We are nearing the end of this webinar. Due to time constraints, unfortunately, we won't be able to address all the questions posted here. But I sincerely hope that all our attendees must have had a fruitful session. Thank you so much, Dr. Paroi, for this wonderful, wonderful session discussing, unraveling many of the unheard aspects of Orwell's writing. And we hope to have more of such academic sessions with you in the future. Here, I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Royal Global University, Professor Dr. S.P. Singh, Chairperson Academics, Professor Dr. Alok Kumar Buragohai, and RGU Registrar Angira Memani Ma'am, for the immense support in helping us organize this webinar. My gratitude to Professor Krishna Barua Ma'am and my fellow colleagues for extending their immense help throughout. I would also like to thank the IT department for helping us glide through the technicalities in arranging this webinar. Lastly, dear participants, we really appreciate you for being here. Here, I would also like to mention that we have received an overwhelming response of over 400 participants in today's webinar. Once again, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to one and all for participating in today's webinar, and we hope to see you again next time.
Thank you very much.